Namaskar, salam alaikum, good evening to everyone out there, whether you're in the diaspora or whether you're at home in Guyana. Welcome to another edition of Globespan, which is presented to you by Mr. Nohar Singh and a very credible and capable and competent technical team that is operating out of Richmond Hill. So today's program, we've titled it A Nation Divided, because we're concerned about what's happening in Guyana. And we would like to have a series of discussion about how we can move ahead from here. So basically, what we would like to do tonight is to focus on two questions. One is, why is Guyana in such a political mess today? And secondly, how do we get out of this political mess in Guyana? So we'll come back to those two questions in a minute. But like I said, we will continue with the series of discussion. We're hoping to continue next Wednesday. And we will have other shows dealing with some of the same issues that we're facing in Guyana. But before we get there, let me just say that we know that the count of people who are infected by the virus in Guyana has been increasing. I believe last count was 54 or 55. So our hearts go out to those of you who have lost loved ones, and we hope that you take precautions to be safe. I know there are people who died, especially in New York, and they're having wake using Skype and Google Meet and Google Hangout. So technology comes into play here. So that's where we are. It is a serious virus, so please take care of yourself. At the same time, we have a lot of people, politicians especially, some of whom in different parts of the world have actually take a pay cut, or they've given financial donations to families who have been affected. And speaking of politicians, we have two guests today who will guide us in this topic that we've adopted, A Nation Divided. My first guest is Dr. David Hinds, who is an associate professor at Arizona State University. As all Guyanese know, Dr. Hinds is a leader or one of the members of the WPA. The WPA is a part of the APNU plus AFC coalition. Dr. Hinds also writes a weekly piece in the Sunday Kaichur News. Our other guest is Mr. Ravi Dev. Mr. Dev writes for the Guyana Times. He was a leading member, if not the member, of ROAR, which was an organization that existed sometime, and I'm guessing he'll talk more about that. But he was the leader of ROAR. But not many people know that he was also a former member of parliament. So, like I said, we're going to have these two gentlemen guide us, and we are hoping to have a series of discussion about the nature of Guyanese politics. I am your humble moderator. As some of you know, I was also associated with ROAR, but today I am going to moderate. That's the hat I am wearing today. So let's get back to Guyana. As people would say, things not regular in Guyana. So we have a situation where things are very tense. And in my opinion, there are two myths that are being perpetrated. One of them has to do with the fact that there are many Guyanese who believe that race is a sort of a epiphenomenal kind of thing. In other words, it exists during election time, that it's not really a serious issue. So I do beg to differ with that, because if we're having an issue every 5 years and we're dealing with the issues that has to do with race and ethnicity, it is a serious problem, right? And the other issue, and again, this is my opinion on this, there's a lot of commentators in Guyana who tend to assume that within the coalition, there may be a faction, given all the things that have been happening since May 2nd. My position on this is that there is one captain in this coalition, and the buck stops with that captain. So I don't see a split, as some people like Freddie Kissoon and others have argued. So without much ado, let's get into our discussion today. And like I said, our two guiding questions would be, why is Guyana in this political mess today? And secondly, how do we get out of this mess? And we have two competent people who have been very much involved. They do understand Guyanese society very well. They have had discussions before, but this is a different climate in which we're living. So let me, pose my first question to Dr. Hinds. Dr. Hinds, can you break it down for us and for our audience? Can you tell us why we are in this political mess today in Guyana?
Well, it's a combination of the accident of history. If history is accidental, it's a combination of our history and the way in which our different ethnic groups arrived in Guyana and the circumstances surrounding their arrival. We know that the native Indians were here, and then the Europeans came, and that contact was a contact grounded in conflict. Africans then came here against their will, brought by Europeans in what we now know as chattel slavery. And that contact itself was grounded in conflict. It had to be because one group was bringing another group against its will. Africans came and they met native Indians here, and the relationship between those two groups has not always been a harmonious relationship. The Amerindians, as you know, were solicited and used by the Europeans during the period of slavery, in a sense, to act as slave catchers of Africans. And so we see conflict developing there. The end of enslavement in 1834 and 1838 saw a new a wave of immigration into Guyana. And this time, our Chinese, Portuguese, and East Indian brothers and sisters came in what was called indentureship. And the circumstances in which they came provided the kind of atmosphere for the use of a kind of divide and rule, which was always used by the Europeans. And so therefore, they quickly developed conflict between them and African Guyanese, who saw these new immigrants as coming to undercut their struggle. And so therefore, conflict developed. I made that intervention there to argue that the circumstances under which the different groups came to Guyana was one that was grounded in conflict. And so if one were to say the birth of the nation itself was grounded in conflict, we know that colonial rule went on until 1960s. And during that period, we had groups, the various ethnic groups engaging in solidarity with each other sometimes. Those who are interested in that can read Walter Rodney's History of the Guyanese Working People, in which the central thesis of that book was to point out that despite the conflict between the various groups, there were times when they acted in solidarity with each other against colonialism. But by the time we got to the 1950s and the period of decolonization and the fact that the Europeans given notice that they were exiting, partly because of their own contradictions in Europe arising out of the Second World War, but partly because of the constant struggle of the various ethnic groups, in particular African Guyanese and Indian Guyanese, against their condition of bondage. And so we got in the 1950s, and the question as we were coming out of colonialism and coming into the period of independence was who governs? Governs. And that question opened up the conflict that was there at the beginning. And the various groups began to contest each other for governance. Ironically, there was a united movement around the early People's Progressive Party, but that soon broke under the weight of that question, who governs? As we know, we went into independence, fighting between ourselves as to who should govern, and the Europeans, with our input, meaning the leaderships of the two major ethnic groups, left us with a political system that had worked very well in Europe. That is the majoritarian Westminster system. They gave us that system, and we accepted that system. And what we have seen since independence in 1966 is the conflict between that seminal question, who governs, and the political system that says one group or one party must govern. And so my argument here in this beginning, that the conflict that we have seen since independence and that we are in the presence of at this very moment, that situation, that conflict is born of the tension between our the seminal question of who governs and the political system that says one side should govern. And I think that if you were to break it down to its common, very, very, very common denominator, I would say that's the central question we're facing now.
Mr. Dev, any disagreement with what Dr. Hinds said, and how do you see the problem in Guyana today?
Well, I think we don't disagree in the larger picture. I think we happen to agree that the problems we are engaged and engulfed in right this minute has its roots in our history. So what I'd like to do is to maybe look at that history a little more granularly, based on theories, because our whole notion of what's going on here, I don't think it has been given enough attention from the perspectives that have been gleaned from other societies, because our ethnic problems in Guyana is not a unique one. And when I returned to Guyana in the late 1980s, by that time a seminal book had been put forward called Ethnic Groups in Conflict, which looked at this new phenomenon to Guyana, to look at it from that perspective. But it was now becoming the most, how would I put it, the most common form of conflict across the world. So to my surprise, when I returned in the late 80s, all of our political parties were still looking at our politics, not even from the liberal perspective that the British had bequeathed us, but from a Marxist perspective. And Marxism very clearly said, as you alluded to in the beginning, that listen, this whole point about identity politics and nationalism, that is all an epiphenomenon. It's not real. So the whole point about it is those who now were going to be inheriting the apparatus of the state did not even have a grasp of what they were grappling with. And that has done a tremendous damage to where we are today. In fact, that has been judged, and I wrote extensively about it in the early 90s. There was a conflict about the conflict. What is this conflict about? So when I first came back, Mr. Hoyt in the newspapers opposed our formulations about ethnicity, and in fact it was we who point out the word ethnic, which has to do with your culture, the way you look at the world, the narrative you have in your head as to how you see what's going on. That is what was important, not your race, because race in itself doesn't add anything to the picture. So to come back to what David said in terms of the historical development, when the Indians were brought into the society, Creole culture to a certain extent had already formed for over 100 years between the Europeans and the Africans. So when the Indians were brought into that picture, the Europeans had already imparted a certain evaluation of themselves at the top of the heap, culturally superior. Africans didn't have any particular culture. For quite a while, they had debated whether Africans even had a soul to be saved by Christianity. But the point is that by the time we came in 1838, there was a certain commonality in what we would call Creole culture between those two groups. It had been worked out. So we now were plunged into that culture, and Indians were placed at the bottom of the heap in that culture because you didn't speak the language, you weren't Christians, you were still doing what you call slave work. So the important factor about this point in our history is where the Indians were placed. But by the turn of the century, after indentureship was abolished, after the abolition, by that time, two things happened. Indians were increasing in numbers to equal and would soon surpass African Guyanese by 1915. And simultaneously with that movement, they were beginning to enter what was then called open society. And this was where the relations between the two groups started, and it's still not resolved yet. Because what the Indians did, as Professor Sicharan showed, between 1929 and 1945, the Indians entered that open society, and using rice farming, using cattle rearing, using these alternate methods of earning money, they catapulted themselves to compete with those who in the colored and African sections felt that they were on top. And this caused a lot of not only talk, but a lot of concern. So for instance, in the 1920s, when there was talk of renewed emigration into Guyana, some African organizations were put up. The Negro Progress League, for example, even Critchlow, with his union, spoke up against this new development. How could you bring in more Indians into Guyana and change this balance? The point was that it was the planters who wanted more Indians. And to their credit, it was Indians within the BGIA, like Kewal, who argued against it. But the point I want to make here is that this whole ethnic, I would say, conflict started out very early. But after the People's Progressive Party came into being in 1950, I think they tried to paper it over, and there developed a norm coming out of their Marxist perspective that we shouldn't talk about it. Today, if we want to look at the silver lining as to where we are, today, unlike what I reached in 1990 when I came out with a paper called For a New Political Culture, today, at least, I think no politician in Guyana will not concede the salience of ethnicity in our politics.
Well, gentlemen, that's a very good history, and you guys are well versed in that. So I do want to fast forward a little bit here. Let's talk a little bit about our political leaders who we entrust to solve these problems. So we're dealing with generations of people who came since slavery and since indentureship. So is there was there a problem with our political leadership that compounded this problem, or why couldn't they have a vision to address this issue since it's such a divisive issue today? David, you first.
Yeah. Let me address that question by way of picking up from where Ravi left off and introducing two things into the discourse. The first thing is that as we entered independence as a very partitioned society, um, in that the various ethnic groups were grounded in different aspects of the political economy. By the time we got to independence, African Guyanese were mostly in the civil service as we knew it in those days, slash the public service that we know it now. They were in the professions such as teaching and nursing, and in the protective forces, the police force and the army and so forth. Indian Guyanese were grounded for the most part in the agriculture sector. So, and Portuguese and Chinese were in the commercial sector, and Indians themselves were becoming more and more part of that commercial sector. So I think that profile of Guyana as we went into independence is very important when we begin to have discourses like this. Because what we're trying to do is to take our minds from 2020 and try to put it within a larger perspective. Because one can become prisoners of the present, as I suspect that we are at the moment. And when you become prisoners of the present, you lack a larger understanding of the historical perspective. And as Ravi Dev said, you lack a larger understanding of the global perspective, that this thing is not unique to Guyana. That there are many societies like Guyana. So I just wanted to introduce that. The second thing I wanted to add to what Ravi said, there was arts, strand in our understanding of organization and development and the political economy in Guyana. It was very strong. But there was also another strand, which I think we can trace back to the UC Guyana. By the early 1960s, himself a Marxist, but recognize what we are talking about here today, that ethnicity is salient in the society. And so they therefore introduced an analysis and a mode of looking at Guyana that I think continued throughout the years, but of course was always drowned out by this Marxist perspective, which played down ethnicity and played up the whole notion of class and nationalism. It was Guyana, for example, in 1961, who introduced into the discourse what we today call shared governance and power sharing. But I just wanted to emphasize that strand in our discourse, mute as it was through the years, but it was always there. Now to your question about leadership. To understand the behavior of the leadership, again, we have to go back to Ravi Dev's thing about the overpowering notion of Marxism. In that Marxism was a very powerful tool in the hands of post-colonial leaders across the world. It wasn't just Guyana, because it spoke to the very logic of post-colonialism and how you deal with the structural problems that we inherited from independence. And most leaders saw the Marxist analysis as a very, very powerful tool in that regard. And I think grabbed it. The problem, as is saying, is that there was a contradiction between Marxism, that Marxist analysis, and the reality of ethnicity. And I don't think that we quite worked it out. Perhaps I would say Guyana is the only major leader who I think worked it out the farthest. I don't think Walter Rodney, certainly when he dealt with Guyana, worked that out. It was a problem that we were alerted to by CLR, our Caribbean and Trinidadian philosopher, who pointed out that contradiction between ethnicity and race and the way that one has to keep working at it. I think the fact of not working it out, or did not pay much attention to working it out is one of the reasons that we are where we are today. The other thing about leadership is that we developed a leadership that preferred expediency over solution of hard problems. The problem of ethnicity is a very difficult problem, but it is a problem that could be overcome. The other societies around the world work through that problem and at least contained it. And I think part of what we got caught up with is that our leaders chose expediency over working out this problem, which I think can be worked out. As a result, they kept kicking the ball down the road. And as I have observed elsewhere, I think 2020 marks the end of that road. I don't think it can be kicked any further, but I'll stop there for the moment.
So let me throw this question to Mr. Deb. Now we're in 2020, right? We've talked about the historical evolution of this problem, but 2020, why are we still dealing with this issue of race and ethnicity?
You see, we really can't move away from the history because, as Faulkner said, you can't forget the past. The past is still with us. It's not even over. And there was another guy, Marx, ironically, who said, men make their history, but they don't make it in circumstances of their making. So the circumstances that we are trying to make our history today, it still resonates from what happened before. So let me tell you my personal experience. When I returned, I got to know Chetty Jagan in 88, when I came back to invite him to a global conference of Indians in New York. And so by 89, 90, when I came up with this paper for a new political culture, in which I talked about ethnic politics and came up with some proposals, I went to the three parties. I wrote about this last week. And I spoke to the PNC, Michael Paris was then the chairman, and they agreed we're going to use this paper as the basis for a symposium. Cherry Jagan agreed, but the WPA, interesting, the group that I was closest to, and went almost weekly to have discussion, by that time, out of the legacy of people like Walter Rodney, felt that the racial issue had been resolved. I think it went back to their experiences in the 70s or 80s. But by 1990, still insisted that the racial problematic had been resolved, and there was no symposium. Now, in that paper, I just want to elaborate a little bit of what we said, going back to move from history to put it in this context of which this guy Horowitz had put forward in ethnic groups in conflict, because it was amazing when I look at this analysis of other societies, how it seems we were playing in almost a play that had already been scripted for us. Horowitz put it in a very simple equation. He says in these groups where you have these different ethnic groups, there's a process of what you call group comparison. Inevitably, we will compare ourselves to each other. And when, as in the case of Guyana, the backward group, which were Indians, were now moving not only to take their place in society, but Africans and colors were seeing that these people might literally sweep over them and jump over them in terms of their participation in the public service. They didn't get in, but they were knocking on the doors. The businesses were already in Water Street. In terms of their rice industry, they were totally dominant there, cattle and other things. So if they were now allowed, as Chetty Jagan now upset the apple cart, changed the whole order, even though he was a Marxist, he was now bringing in Indians because they now all would have the same vote as the other groups. And it is for this, a fellow by the name of Critchlow, who originally pushed for universal franchise, by that time opposed it, because he saw if the Indians, who by that time had a higher birth rate than Africans, if they were to continue and to get political power, there was created in the African sections of this country a fear, to use Horowitz's words, of being swamped and subordinated. That is a fear that I believe still persists to today, and is still there, and we have to talk about it. I raised that fear in 1990. And after the PPP won, I was at a conference in Trinidad on violence with Professor Miller from Jamaica, along with President Baroness Scotland was there, presented a paper, and I predicted in 93 that there'd be violence in Guyana for the same reason, that the fear of the African Guyanese of being swamped and subordinated has not gone away. What made me think a lot was in 1965, Professor Arthur Lewis, Nobel Prize winner, as urbane as you can think about, in his book, Politics in West Africa, made a statement that really made me sit up and take notice. He said, upon counting heads, are the Africans of Guyana to be exterminated? I said, my God, what a word. How? Because we are now looking into the minds of the African West Indian and the African Guyanese by extension. That this whole thing, and in fact, Laming, in his introduction to Rodney's book of 1980, has a very, very printed posthumously, of course, interesting epigraph. It says, this is Laming's talking from Barbados, of course, Wade Laming, who passed away recently. The perception of the Indian as alien and as a problem to be contained after the departure of the imperial power has been a major part of the thought and feeling of Black West Indians, and a very stubborn conviction among the Black middle class layers in Trinidad and Guyana. In politics or in business, the progress of Indians in these areas are seen as a strategy for conquest. And this is what we have to understand that is going on right now. So what this group comparison, when you compare yourself as the first process, in Guyana, and this is unique, and I take it every time, but I want to mention this, it's important. In Guyana, unique to us. I'm getting a reverb. Are you hearing me clearly?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Yes.
Yeah,
In Guyana, there was a second part to the Horowitz equation, group legitimacy. In Guyana, the African Guyanese segment of our population, because of having come as slaves and literally slaved for this country, you can't get more literal than that. Their prior arrival, being educated first, entering the open society first, becoming Christians first, doing all the jumping through all the hoops, they felt and still feel, in my estimation, that they have a greater legitimacy to political power in Guyana. And I think this is the elephant in the room that we have to grapple with. That if African Guyanese see themselves with a greater legitimacy, and you hear all this, all the time you'll hear that. My friend Eric Phillips constantly will throw out all these notions that I've spoke about, prior arrival, earlier culturalization, British culture, and all these things. David talks about blacks having, African Guyanese having more universalistic values and what have you. So when you combine this sense of group worth being threatened, because the individual personality is integrally correlated with the group worth. So when you have a situation where you're going to lose it all to these people who were backward yesterday, it's a very strong sentiment. And that is why I feel the leaders today have to be very careful in the language that they speak. And this is why I thought, as I used the term to David in another conversation, I think this present language is infelicitous. It is not very felicitous in this present circumstances, because it can raise those sentiments of swamping and subordination, and doesn't really add to a discourse where we can all look at the narrative of each other.
Let me just say this. Like I said, if you are just joining us on the show, we did say we're going to continue to have these kinds of discussion. I know the burning issue, and I know Guyanese are pissed as hell, pardon the expression, about what's happening since May 2nd. So let's fast forward this and talk about, we've talked about the historical evolution of the problem. We've talked about the ideological issue to a certain extent, but let's talk about current events 2020. Now, one of the things that's being proposed in an ethnically divided society is that, we try to come up with a relationship so we can sort of establish this nirvana on earth. And one of the things that's been proposed is power sharing. So I'm going to direct this question to David. If we agree in 2015 to play by a certain rules, we have an election, one party won or a coalition won, and they control the power, right? Because they won. That's the nature of the game. So 2020, we have another competition, right? One party in the middle of the game, and I did compare this to a game of cricket. You're playing a game, but in the middle of the game, one party decides that, okay, this thing is not going my way, so therefore I'm going to take the wicket and move on. So we have an impasse in 2020, and again, situation may not have been very similar to what we had in 2015, but we had a transition in 2015. What is the problem now? And David, you did make some statements, which I want to come back to, but why can't we have a fair transition based on a verified account of the votes?
Let me try to answer that question in the spirit of the discussion we're having now, because this discussion is a nation divided and looking for solutions. I think your starting of history in 2015 is part of the problem, right? I mean, to understand that what we spend the last half an hour trying to say is that what we're seeing in 2020 did not begin in 2015. It began a long time ago. And even if we come closer to history, we go back to 1961. And I did make reference that in 1961, power sharing was put on the table. It's not 2015. You see, one of the problems we face is this. Indian Guyanese believe that the problem in Guyana is the PNC, and African Guyanese believe the problem is the PPP, right? And some neutral people believe the problem is both of them, right? And I think all three of those conclusions are partly wrong. As Ravi and I have been trying to say, the problem transcends the political party and the political leadership. It arises out of the nature of the society, the historical development of the society. But it also arises out of choices our political leadership made since independence. The very Marxists were using Marxism as a form of analysis, but were engaging in ethnic mobilization, both the PPP and the PNC. And I think we cannot ignore that. So, Beto, the problem with power sharing is not better 2015 or 2020. Power sharing was put on the table in 1961. It was rejected by both groups. Dr. Jagan, by the time he got to 1963, realized the wisdom of power sharing and put forward his own ideas for sharing power with the PNC. By that time, the PNC had worked out that the new electoral system suited them. So they formed a coalition, and we know that the rest is history. Power sharing was put back on the table by Dr. Jagan and the PPP in 1977 with the National Patriotic Front. The PNC rejected it. The WPA put it back on the table in 1979. It didn't get very far. By 1985, the PPP and the PNC are in talks for power sharing. Burnham dies, Hoyt comes in, and Hoyt, I was about to say scrap it, but I'll get in trouble. Hoyt discontinued those talks. And let me tell you a little bit of history that is not well known. When we got to 1990, and the Carter Center brokered an agreement between the two major political parties. We then had to postpone the elections from 1990. Eventually, it was held in 1992. And Mr. Hoyt remained in power as a kind of interim government. All right? No, let me tell you something else. The WPA proposed to the PPP, look, let us not leave Hoyt alone with these 2 years. Let us have an interim government with Hoyt as the president and somebody from the PCD as the prime minister, and they have an interim government. The PPP said the PNC will never agree to it, but they gave us permission to go and talk to the PNC. When we went to the PNC, Mr. Hoyt and the PNC accepted. They said, yes, we want an interim government. We went back to the PPP. By that time, the PPP had worked out, as Jack Burnham did in '64, that power was coming. And it didn't. We didn't have an interim government. After the conflict in 1997, and the PPP's term in office was cut by 2 years, the WPA again floated the idea that the next 2 years, we should use those 2 years and have an interim government with Jack Dior's president and the PNC leader as the prime minister. At that time, they were in war mode and neither group was open to it. Later on, the point I'm making here is that we are not familiar with our own history. And because we are not familiar with our own history, we feel sometimes that people are ganging up on us. We feel that we can't solve our problems. We can solve these problems. We've been talking for 60 years. And so my point is, don't compare 2015 with 2010. When I propose an interim government now, I am moving past my party. I am moving past the side that I'm voting for. I'm saying that we need a bigger picture. We need to think of the country. And that proposal was in the spirit of joint premiership of '61, was in the spirit of the interim government that we proposed in 1990, was in the spirit of the interim government we proposed in 1990. Let me finish. In the spirit of the interim government that we proposed after 1997, it's not a new proposal. We think it's new because we think we are fighting a new war. What we are fighting is an old battle. And so therefore, I think in conversations like these, I think we have to move beyond and above cliches and begin to look at this thing in a clear-headed way and try to not attach ourselves.
Yeah, but David, perception is also important. Perception is also important, right? And I get what you're saying. So let me ask Mr. Dev this question. It seems like, if power sharing is an issue, it should be on the table consistently, right? The coalition claimed that it is a coalition. And again, the WPA, your political party, is part of the coalition. We did not hear a lot about power sharing since 2015, but it seems like if the coalition seems like it's losing, and it always comes back to this issue when the PPP is in power or seems to be winning an election, then power sharing is being thrown on the table. So, Mr. Dev, can you respond to that?
Let me use the same format that David is talking about in terms of we can't disjuncture what is going on today with our beginnings. And my central problem with what is going on today is that we cannot go forward as a people when you have made what I call sacred agreements, something called a constitution, which is a social contract between all of us, the people of Guyana, and our government. And when you enter government, we cannot just expediently discard that contract, that constitution that is supposed to be sacred to us. It then, because that vitiates the very foundation of us going forward to our people. And this was Rodney's central problem with the PNC, because the PNC did not, in 1968, when it started to rig election, it did not overtly say that, listen, African Guyanese as a minority will not be able to get any power, and therefore I have to rig it. I have to rig. That was the subtext, and that is what, wink, wink, a lot of African Guyanese cut him some slack. And Rodney's point about it, and he said this explicitly, that this is a very slippery slope, that when you violate such an agreement, eventually all of us will be consumed. All of us will be consumed. Where do you draw the line? Because how do you trust such a government? And we saw what the PNC government did to all of Guyana. And I want to remind David, when the WPA in 1979 talked about a unity government, they refused to accept that the PNC should be part of that government. The formulation was that their PNC is part of the problem. How could they be part of the solution? And this was the fundamental objection to the PNC, that they refuse to play by the rules that they themselves are only giving lip service to. So when we come back to where we are today, you see, ethnicity and ethnic politics isn't also stagnant. When I entered the scene in 1990, I introduced something called the ethnic security dilemmas of both the African Guyanese. That if African Guyanese, who did all of those things for Guyana, if they were to, upon counting heads, since Indians were the majority, and if they voted monolithically, the African Guyanese will never be in a position to be in the executive of this country. And all studies of ethnicity has shown that each one of us want to see ourselves reflected in government. You might not get much benefit, but it gives you a psychic gratification. So to come back to where we are, though, things have changed. The Indian security dilemma, incidentally, was that even if Indians won the elections, which they did in 92, I said this in 90, if they won in 92, would they be able to govern? And I said they will not be able to govern because the army was controlled by the PNC. The police force was controlled. When I say controlled, even if you don't actually push the buttons, they have a kind of an affinity. Mr. Hoy talks about kith and kin right after 92 and so on. So my point is that by 2015, however, and I argue this point through from 2008, 2009, 2010, I argued it with Fred Kissinger, with Eric Phillips, with Lincoln Lewis, and others. I don't know if David entered that discussion. Their point was that the PPP was an elected dictatorship. And my point was that to call it a dictatorship implies that it can control, that it can't get out of office. And I said, no, that the demographics had changed. When I campaigned with GAP in 2006, I saw the Indian population was literally decreasing to so much. And I said, if the PNC could change its image, it's on the record, 2008, 2009, and if they could reach out, I think we will be moving past this. Lo and behold, the AFC came into the picture, and as Nigel Hughes pointed out, when Trotman was head of the AFC, they pulled Afro-Guyanese votes. When Ramjitan in 2011 came, they were able to pull Indo votes. So the point is that is the very definition of a shifting vote. And therefore, by 2011, you had a de facto PPP being voted out. It's just that through our peculiar plurality, Mr. Ramutar retained the presidency. But in 2015, at long last, we were able to change a government at the polls. This is very, very important. The African security dilemma is over. And I'm telling you, this is my firm conviction. I'm on record on this. If the PNC, I don't forget about this APNU, David himself complained more than anybody else, but they weren't consulted. If the PNC had taken cognizance of the wider society, particularly the Indo votes, not shut down those sugar estates as they are, not pack the cabinet with that many Afro-Guyanese, not pack all the permanent secretaries, 16 out of 17, not pack all the heads of department, all of that. I am telling you, APNU could have won another election. So I say, and this is where I said this in response to David, I mightn't have called his name in my last article. I think right now, African Guyanese leaders are using an expired strategy. They're still fighting that battle out of the 60s, where they could have been swamped and subordinated. I really do believe that, like Ghana has an ethnically plural society just like ours. They call it tribes, they're the same race, but it's just, and from 1992, just like us, to today, you now have regularly alternating government in Ghana. And all they did, they were able to develop that pool of swing votes. I think to their credit is that the PNC, for the duration, has really harmed their own chances. They've shot themselves in the foot. And I want to end on this note. In 1974, the PNC tried to frame as a political prisoner a fellow by the name of Arnold Rampersad. And Rodney stood up because they couldn't convict the fellow in Berbice where the trial went on. And Mr. Burnham brought the trial to Georgetown. And Rodney made a very, very famous speech. And he said, African Guyanese came out of slavery with their dignity. And what Mr. Burnham is doing today to say, we bring this Kuliman from Berbice, and they wouldn't convict him, but we bring him to Georgetown, you black people will convict him. And what Rodney told the African Guyanese people is that you're not doing any service to your ancestors. And this is what I say today to David. I say it very seriously, and to all African Guyanese, to say that the PNC should be allowed to rig an election, rig it so flagrantly, is not doing justice to what African Guyanese have done for this country, to the dignity that they came out to have founded the village movement, to have founded democracy in this country. I don't think they're doing a service to African Guyanese.
Gentlemen, I want to come back and keep the focus on this ethnic security dilemma. But our producers are saying that they need to make an announcement, and we do have some people who would like to ask questions. So I am going to hand it over to our producers for an announcement.
Did you know the FBI warned against using public Wi-Fi? And hackers using public Wi-Fi can download viruses and steal all of your private information. Let Globespan help you protect against hackers by providing you with a virtual private network or VPN. Keep all of your data hidden and protected, including sensitive information, documents, bank account numbers, and more. The FBI recommends using a VPN, and Globespan can help provide one for you. It's very simple and easy to use. Call Globespan today. In Georgetown, call 225-9054. In West Coast, call 269-0141. Or in the United States, call 718-551-3290. You are now able to work from home or from anywhere with a cloud computer. No more worrying if you can't get to the office. Access all of your files and work in an efficient manner with a cloud computer. Best of all, no waiting for a technician to show up to fix all of your computer crashes or viruses or any computer problem. No more worrying about power surge or losing your files. Let Globespan set up a cloud computer for you to work from home or anywhere. Access with a laptop, iPad, or any device that you may have. You can set up your own passwords and keep all your information hidden. Globespan will set up all the antivirus programs, automatic backups, and configure a computer to fit your needs. Globespan has technicians in the US and Guyana to assist you. Call Globespan today. In Georgetown, call 225-9054. In West Coast, call 269-0141. Or in the United States, call 718-551-3290.
All right, so we're back, and I'd like to give Dr. Hinds a chance to respond to what Mr. Dev said a few minutes ago, a few seconds ago.
Sure. There was a reason that I introduced what I call the alternative stand, and I have to give credit for that terminology to the late and Guy, because I think we assume there is one strand, one worldview in the African Guyanese community, and I beg to differ. I think it's more complex than that. I think there's always been contending worldviews within the African Guyanese community, or two contending political instincts. There is the instinct, the party instinct, the PNC as the party that is. But there is another strong instinct. And again, I go back to Guyana, because Rodney was not an island. Rodney arrived in Guyana, and he was able to take that strand that Guyana pioneered and take it to another level. And that strand continues in the African Guyanese community to this day. All right? There is a tension in the African Guyanese community between electoral logic and the dignity logic that Ravi Dev is talking about. The logic that says that the solution to Guyana's problem is not at the ballot box. It is in reaching across the aisle to our Indian Guyanese brothers and sisters and work out something. And it's enough credit. It's not always given to that strand in the African. It is that strand that made Rodney and Guyana and Thomas and others stood up and said, "You will not kill Arnold Rampersad." That strand that made Andaye, Guyana, and myself, I was the little boy among them. It was that strand that when Africans were killing Indians from the Buxton, we stood up in the face of guns and say it's wrong. It's wrong. It is that strand that made me, from 2015, decide that I am not going to allow a government to behave badly in the name of African Guyanese. Mr. Dev, there are two instincts within the African Guyanese community. No matter how they try to pin me to the PNC, I will not be pinned. All right? I come from a different strand within the African Guyanese community. The strand that does not see the solution at the ballot box, right? Ravi, you introduced an interesting notion that the victory
I did.
15 meant we have solved the dilemma. I think that is akin to saying the election of Obama in Guyana, in America, was the end of race. The election in 2015 did not solve the African Guyanese insecurity and fears and the ethnic security dilemma. In fact, I would argue that it compounded it. It compounded it. And so therefore, I disagree, Ravi, that what happened in 2015 solves the problem. If it did, I would argue respectfully that we would not be where we are in 2020. The security dilemma cannot be solved at the ballot box. That's what's driving me. I understand elections and all of those things, and I participate. But I'm under no illusion that elections could solve our problems in Guyana. And this thing that elections are so sacred and so on. My goodness, the ULF in Trinidad, boycotting elections. I think it was the 72 or 76 election. In Guyana, some of us boycotted the 1980 election. We boycotted the referendum.
But
All
David,
of us.
why should we have an election to which your party is
Let me
part of?
finish. Then you can ask your question, right? There are instances when people have turned their backs on elections. In Jamaica, in 1982, the PNP boycotted an election. There are instances on the matter of principle when we have turned our back on elections. Dr. Jagan was very clear that he was participating in elections from 68 to 92, not because he believed that those elections would solve anything, but because he wanted a representation in parliament, to use parliament as a forum for the larger struggle. So this thing about the sacrosanct of elections and so on, elections are important, but I think elections don't solve hard problems all of the time. And in this instance, I am not saying that there must not be elections. My argument is as elections within context where the security of all the ethnic groups cannot be guaranteed will get us to where we are in 2020. Elections in which the security of all ethnic groups are guaranteed will throw up a different outcome than the one we have in 2020.
Let me address some of what David said.
One second, I'll give you a chance to respond, and then when you're done, we have some guests who have some questions to both of you. So, so you want to give a response, and then we'll.
What David is arguing is he's conflating two problematics. One, elections per se, and secondly, the outcome of elections, whether they are fair or not. And my point about this is that if this were the issue, then the PNC should not have gone in to the 2015 election. But my point is that they were not concerned about sharing. Ironically, they even put it in their manifesto. They use that term, and I'm told it was a WPA that introduced it, that I brought up, ethnic impact statement, that before you do anything, you know it will have an ethnic impact. For Christ's sake, excuse my language, but look at it ahead of time so it doesn't blow up in your face. They didn't do it. They even peripheralized the fellow who was supposed to have brought in Indian voters into the PNC, Nagamutu, on the specious argument about, well, the president can't delegate the prime minister. Oops, I didn't mean to give that. Now, that was very specious, and to his eternal indignity, Nagamutu will never be able to live that down. But my point is that the PNC we cannot get away from it. And Mr. Quine once reminded me, when I took a particular stand against Mr. Hoyt, that I should always remember that he is the individual and the PNC is the vehicle into which African Guyanese have given their votes, their choice. So I'm saying we can't have it both ways. The PNC is the representative of the African Guyanese. They might be those two strands, as you said, are acting out, and I have no doubt about that. But by and large, they are the representative. And we cannot go into a contest that they define the rules as, hey, let's go into this contest. And noted that in 2020, they didn't talk anything about power sharing anymore. That was out of the picture. Nothing about that. So you cannot go into an election saying these are the rules of the game, and in midstream, as Beto said, you now change the rules of the game. It is just not cricket. And while we may poo-poo about that you can't hold everything like that, it's an important point, David, because if we are to go forward in this country, if we are to ever go forward together, then we have to respect the rules we ourselves have helped to set up. We can't change them midstream, or else there'll be no trust. And coming back to what we had proposed, unless we do that, I think it still comes out of a feeling, and I see it in the blogs, that there is no place, because nobody talks about the security dilemma of the Indians, where at every moment we're expecting a firestorm to come down upon us. And not to put words in your mouth, David, I think you were alluding to that. Just like I did in 1993, they said all hell will break loose. I think we have to face that possibility because of the sentiments that have been aroused by Afro-Guyanese leadership. But not all. I'm saying the PPP could not, at this present stage, have won this election as they claim to have done, unless there was a significant crossover of Africans and mixed votes along with Amerindians. I am saying that I do believe we have arrived at the point where you have enough of crossover votes where we could have gone on an even swing. And what you're talking about, David, is equity and justice and equal power for Afro-Guyanese as on every other Guyanese. And as I said on programs we were on with Eric, I don't think there's a strand in Indo-Guyanese also. There is not an Indo-Guyanese who I've spoken to among the circles that I have moved who said that Africans in Guyana should not get an equal opportunity. But I want to leave you with this, David, and I'm not in any way trying to be snide, but there's a difference between equality of opportunity and equality of results. And this is where I think we have a problem, that African Guyanese leaders want to blame their own people for not achieving. Burnham tried to do it by saying they're not disciplined. I will pull away all of you into the army and all these and give you a job. It's not going to work. Mr. Burnham destroyed that black middle class that could build ships at Sproston's when I was a boy. The greatest fitter machinist in the Caribbean, who, if had been allowed to in a free economy, could have today been the foundation of businesses. He destroyed them because he thought they would not survive before the discipline that he wanted to mold them. I'm saying again, I believe that African Guyanese, I've seen when I was at the Guyana Times early on, I talk about entrepreneurship. I talked to Eric Phillips about African Guyanese being entrepreneurs, this new economy, that whatever advantage Indians may have had through agriculture and all that, this new economy is a new day, David, it's a new game. And I think African Guyanese, I think African leaders are almost racist when they think that African Guyanese won't be able to compete if they're given an equal chance.
All right, gentlemen, when we talk about the ethnic security dilemma, we also want to remember, we have a growing Amerindian population. But as I said before, this will be a series of continuous discussion. I know everybody wants to talk about, May 2nd and so on, and what happened after that. But we will get to those issues, if not tonight, at our next show, because we want to continue with this discussion, because it is an important discussion. And I appreciate the fact that, we're not cussing each other. We're just talking, in a manner that is very respectful. So we do have some guests who have some questions. There's a young man. I'll go to him first. His name is Ferlin Pedro. He's very active in social media. Very smart, very articulate, and I know the future of Guyana is really in the hands of young folks like yourself. So, Ferlin, I know you have questions for our two guests.
Thank you very much for the introduction. I'm very pleased to be among these distinguished guests, yourself included. And before I get into the question, I've been listening to the entire conversation for the evening, and I must say that it's been especially for my generation and generations to come, it's been very helpful and very, as you said, articulate the discussion so far. And I think it's been clear from both of our featured distinguished guests. I think Dr. Hinds and Mr. Dev they've both given exceptional surveys of our history. And I think just to quickly add on their historical analysis of Guyanese history, I think it's something that's very vital and very important for Guyana as a whole, especially as we have new generations, children going to school who are going to learn about their their social environment, the people that they will grow up with, their communities, and so on. And some of the questions that I had when I was younger were questions like, why is my community predominantly Indian, or why is this community predominantly African? There are a lot of things that you grow up in Guyanese society and you wish to ask about what causes the social reality that I'm in, and how is that shaping my mindset as a young Guyanese, and to think of myself as a Guyanese. This is the identity aspect of the question. And I find that in at least with the school curriculum, it's not very thorough. It's not very um, um, enabling to figure out these very profound and very important questions as a Guyanese individual. I recognize that myself and my peers who grew up with me, we're not individuals who are coming up from a direct ancestral lineage. Most of us are probably mixed. Some of us are third, fourth generation from our African or Indo ancestors. So we come with with an identity into the Guyanese pool, which is rather different from, let's say, what Mr. Dev and David, Mr. Dr. Hinds, and so on would come out from, and as well as their ancestors. So I think education-wise, this is something that any government, especially in Guyana, needs to directly address. How can we enable our future generations to properly grasp and cope with the social realities that exist? Race being one, and of course, I already mentioned some of the community issues. Um, I have one question mainly directed to Dr. Hines, and then I'll say something about some of uh, Mr. Dev's remarks. But my first question to Dr. Hines is it has to do with the appeal to ethnic security dilemmas, which has been the recent conversation. Um, Guyana is a radically evolving society. We have a very diverse uh, group of peoples. Afro-Guyanese, Indo-Guyanese, of course, make up the majority. But there is a rise in mixed identities, mixed racial groups. Amerindians, of course, and indigenous groups in general, they're becoming a very significant block on their own. And then you have nationalists coming in from different countries, Venezuela, the Caribbean, and even abroad. My question is, how does the ESD, the ethnic security dilemma, as was just being discussed, how does that factor for the future sake of politics in Guyana? How do you see that playing out, given what you've just highlighted to Mr. Dev?
Mhm. Yeah, interesting question. Let me reiterate something, because I think it's been lost there. Y'all are asking me to answer for the PNC. I can't answer for the PNC. I can't. Y'all asking me about rules of the game and rules of the game. I'm insisting. I sit here as I've always sat, from a different strand in the African Guyanese um, thinking. Right? I come from the Payana Rodney strand. Right? That does not see elections as the solution to our ethnic problems. I keep saying that over and over again. And it's not just here, but when I read the newspaper, everybody's trying to make me PNC. I am not PNC. I'm not PNC, right? And I think that's what is confusing the discussion today. That's what I'm saying. Look, there's a strand in the African Guyanese instinct and the worldview that is the ethnic. It is why Rodney could have come in 1974 and go to Linden, the heart of PNC support, and got support there. They never stopped being electorally PNC, as we discovered in 1992, all right? But they recognize that alternative worldview, right? And it is that alternative view that I represent, right? So if I don't pay too much of emphasis to the election as the solution to some problem. Pardon me, right? I come from a tradition that's not too comfortable with that analysis of the world. Following, I think in multi-ethnic societies, we have to operate at various levels. We have to operate at the ethnic level because ethnicity is real, all right? And I think we have to, part of our mistake is ignoring of the salience of ethnicity, as Ravi pointed out earlier, like support that has got us in this problem. I think African Guyanese and Indian Guyanese need to always be exposed to an alternative view than this view that we have to rule one another. All right, we can solve our problems. I think this problem that we're facing can be solved, but it cannot be solved in the electoral discourse. It is never going to be solved there. The discourse has to shift from there to somewhere else. Those who want to fight the electoral battle, fight it. As I said, I'm not coming with you all right? I fight in another battle, all right? So one has to operate at the ethnic level. One also has to operate simultaneously at a human level. I think you hear it in the discourses over the last year. I think we are beginning not to see one another as human beings anymore. When I look and listen and read some of the things that our people are saying about each other, I am becoming fearful about our humanity. And I think we have to put that humanism into the discourse. A couple of years ago, Ravi Dev and I had a series of programs on one of the television stations. And some African Guyanese stopped and were remarking that here is an Indian man who obviously loves his ethnic group, and an African Guyanese who obviously loves his ethnic group, but were talking without fussing out and quarreling. And I think we have to operate at that level. But you can only operate sincerely at that level if you accept.
So, gentlemen, I don't mean to cut you off, but we have a few minutes. David, if you want to finish up your points, and then we can move on.
Yeah, that ethnicity is a real thing. You're talking about the aspirational Guyanese, multi-ethnic thing, where we're all Guyanese. That is also part of the discourse. It's not one or the other, all right? It's all of the levels we have to operate at simultaneously.
All right, so let's, Farland, if you want to keep, I know you said you have a comment, if we can kind of maybe keep it a little brief because we're heading, close to the end, but we'd love to bring you back some other time. And then we'll get to Tara, Dr. Tara Singh. So you want to make your comment?
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Hinds, for those remarks. I think when it comes to the issue of power sharing, which was also a main highlight of this discussion, is that I find that the discourse is heavily geared at the executive, the executive branch of government, and much of the power sharing discourse is not really geared towards empowering the citizen or citizens in general. And I think if we're going to talk about power sharing, shared governance, or anything like that, we have to work from bottom up rather than top down, because at the end of the day, it's people who vote, it's people's voices that should matter. I think that the stuff that is happening on the ground in the grassroots are things that are not magnified at the executive level. And I think this whole discourse that a lot of people are emphasizing on shared governance and power sharing, I think it's one that is not quite the path that we should be talking about right now. I think the discourse should be geared towards empowering people and becoming more participatory in their government, rather than having this, two-party or multi-party executive democratic function. I think I think a participatory democracy is gonna take Guyana forward much more in a better direction than anything that focuses narrowly on the executive. So that's my comment I wanted to make.
Pietro, before you go on, let me just make some comments to young Ferlin's points that he's made, and I've seen some letters, and I think these are the kind of young Guyanese we need to get involved and continue. And I want to reinforce what he says, that we, especially the politicians who come from a different era, they are fighting and using an expired strategy. Today, Guyana is a nation of minorities, and no political party can win an election unless they reach across their own narrow divide and attract voters. In fact, this is one of the goals of power sharing, to force parties to moderate their claims for their own people, so to speak, and reach across. And this is why I want to repeat this point. I firmly believe APNU could have won this election if, I don't know what got into them, if the devil made them do it or what. Why didn't they continue with the approach that brought them their victory in 2015? But we cannot now destroy the whole edifice because of whatever compulsions are acting out in Mr. Granger. I've been told that he was one of the fellas, and there's a picture of him cutting cane back in 1977, even though he was a major or something in the army, and he always held this thing against for Gao to get recognized in that era, and that is why he shut down the Chihuahua Estates. Now, this might be extreme, but this is the kind of irrationality that is brought out when leaders act irrationally as he did. So I want to say, yes, that this thing is not just Indo and Afro. They're now a substantial mixed group, Amerindian groups and others. We have this shifting group where you have to reach across the divide. The second one would be that I want to say that in terms of power sharing, we have not spoken about power sharing from our standpoint. What we introduced was something called federalism or deep decentralization. The essence of federalism is that rather than having all power concentrated in a center, so the prize is so great, everyone is competing for it, what federalism or any other deep decentralization does is to have a matrix of power centers where people at the grassroots and people at other centers can have power, and people will begin to be able to train themselves to use that power. I have always said, again, another mistake of Mr. Burnham to destroy what African Guyanese created in this country was the village government, the village system. You get me? That was the formation of our democratic politics, and by putting all these villages into NDCs, where because of the linear structure of our settlement, there's no unity. For example, I come from a mixed village of Iflat. I literally grew up in the African section, and to talk to Ferlin about how come we're now separated, I saw that. It is the greatest regret of my life that those boys, and we slept and bathed in the seawall and swam in the trenches and cut cane and sucked cane together. It never came back after the 60s. That is what we think, but I'm still a village. And if we had a village council in Iflat, we have been able to try to govern ourselves and deal with our common problems rather than what we have now with this humongous structure that Mr. Burnham came up with in 1980.
All right, gentlemen, I'd like to bring Dr. Tara Singh into the conversation. And again, I know it's we're coming to the end, but I just want to remind our audience we will continue to have these kinds of discussion. We will be here next Wednesday again. So let me bring Tara Singh. I'm sure he has a question for our guest.
Yeah, well, good night, gentlemen. I just have some conceptual issues, really. I know the discussion has focused somewhat on power sharing, and as a young man said, we need some conceptual clarity to that. There's a huge difference between power sharing and inclusive government or shared governance, and we need to clarify those concepts before we get engaged in a proper debate. Secondly, there's a question I want to ask Ravi. You said the African Guyanese believe on pragmatic grounds that they should govern Guyana. Do you think the Amerindians can advance a similar case? I'll ask you to respond to that just now. The other thing is with David has been saying that elections cannot solve all problems. He's correct. I agree with that.
Well, Tara, why don't you have Dev respond to that, and then you can direct the other question to Dr. Hinds.
Okay.
Absolutely, Dr. Singh. We have talked about this on many occasions, that the Amerindians are the indigenous people of this land, and they were never defeated. You know, the British assumed sovereignty over Guyana, but they had to have treaties with those Amerindians. So the Amerindians are the original owners of this country. And that is why I'm always flabbergasted when individuals raise concerns about them getting 24% of Guyana demarcated for them. Geez, I mean, all of it is theirs. And we should all have some gratitude that we've been able to carve out some space for ourselves. So yes, the Amerindians have a great case for making the same claims that others are making, because if you talk about prior arrival giving you greater legitimacy to power, then the Amerindians were the first here. They laid claims to this. When Columbus was passing by in 1498 on his third voyage, there were Amerindians looking at his caravel going down over the beach. And as I look now, I'm looking right at the Atlantic 200 yards from me, where Columbus probably passed.
All right, Dr. Tara Singh?
Okay, yeah, yes, elections cannot solve all the social economic problems of any system, whether it's a country or a bigger collection of countries, we call a commonwealth or a bloc like the European Union, etc. But there are other issues like racism, which is tied to the legitimacy of the political system, that be solved by other institutions that is set up. You need not need an election to solve them. Like you can have equal employment opportunity commission, etc. But one of the things, and what I like about his suggestion about introduction of humanism in our discourse, that is very, very important. None of us has a monopoly over knowledge, and all of us are free to express our views and ideas. There's a marketplace of free ideas. Those people with the superior ideas will eventually prevail. I just want to make one final comment. On the last program I saw on Wednesday, the gentleman who was representing the PNC was questioning how the PP can move, jump, since they were losing vote between 2006 to 2011, how they can increase the win that PP is claimed by 16 to 17,000 votes. Well, I just want to remind them, a simple thing is, the PP won the local government election by 24,000 votes against the APNU and the AFC combined. And in the 2018 election, they won by over 45,000 votes. So they had that upward momentum going. And partly because of the poor performance of the PNC, as Ravi mentioned, the PP was able to make that substantial gain. I have more comments, but the time is running out.
So it's not a question then, it's more of a comment you're saying?
More a comment, yeah. Mm-hmm.
All right, so, the one thing I want to point out, and again, I keep saying this to our audience, we will continue to have this discussion because, we can all agree that the counting and the verification of the ballots will take some time, the way things are going. And this discussion will continue because, as our two main guests have indicated, it's an issue that has divided us, over the years, right? So we will continue to have this discussion. We would like to have our two guests. I know David has said some things, that have riled up a lot of people in the last few days. I'm sure our audience would have some questions about that. But we deliberately make an attempt here tonight, to focus on the sort of evolution of this problem in Guyana. I know for some people it may be a little irritating. Why aren't we talking about the current issues and the current problem that we face? Obviously, we want to give you some kind of chronological evolution to this problem, right? And I keep saying again, we will continue to have this discussion. We are also hoping there are other members, from, let's say, the coalition, the PNC, APNU, and so on, who would like to engage in this kind of discussion, because we think it is very, very crucial and very important. The other thing we need to recognize, obviously, is the fact that the Amerindians have a role to play in this, and I think the fact that they are being represented by a political leader in the name of Schumann, I think that's an important thing to recognize. So in our next focus, we would like to address solutions to our problems. We've talked about a lot about what the problem is, but our next focus will be on how do we get from here to that nirvana. I know some things were mentioned tonight: shared government, federalism. There are people in social media. I've actually responded to a letter written by Eric Phillips. And my question to him was, it seems like he's pushing this notion of partition. I don't know if that's what he has in mind, but we're faced with an impasse in Guyana where we're very, very divided. So this is why I believe that this conversation is important and is crucial to continue. So I want to end by making a reference to a quotation from Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, who was the first elected female head of state in Africa. And her statement was, "Ethnicity should enrich us. It should make us a unique people in our diversity and not be used to divide us." And I think that kind of summarizes, where we are today. We're not paying close attention to the message in that quotation. So having said that, I'd like to give our two guests, one last opportunity, if they can keep it brief and short, to make a closing statement, and maybe they can tell us, why it's important to have these kinds of discussions. So I'll go to Dr. Hinds first.
Yes. Let me start my closing statement by saying the observation that Ravi makes about African Guyanese feeling about ownership of Guyana and so on. It is part of the African Guyanese view, but it is not the only view, Ravi. There are contending views to that. And I think that people like myself come out of that tradition. I think we have to be very careful of not thinking that these groups are monolithic. When it comes to election, they act in a monolithic. And that is the danger of these election story, right? But I think when they sit down and they think about their own humanity and their own dignity, right? It's not a monolith. They are contending worldview. There is a very strong, decent, multi-ethnic worldview among African Guyanese. That doesn't see Amerindians as not having a place in Guyana, or Indians are not having a place. When the late Dr. Chedi Jagan died, and the PPP wanted to only stop in East Indian villages, my village, Buxton, said, "Stop. We want him to stop here." There is another view within our communities. And I think we have to be very careful of not making it into a monolith and then acting on that. Because once we do that, we don't hear reason anymore. I mean, the vitriol that has been thrown in my direction is amazing. Right? But it doesn't stop me, because I'm not wedded to political party. I'm wedded to the wholeness and the health and the future of Guyana. That's my country. There's no other country that I can call my country. And I want Guyana to survive in all its difficulties. And I believe fervently that we can solve these problems. Once we keep putting these discourses on the table, exposing people to another view, I think we will come around. Once this election passes, the work begins. This election story is holding up the work. The work begins once they solve the election. I say there because I'm not part of that.
Mr. Dev?
Well, Mike, there's not much we can add to what we have said before, and basically I do believe that yes, we can go forward and we can address these problems. As to whether we can actually solve them, leaders and leadership strategies are key to the resolution of these problems. And what I would like to say that yes, having grown up in an African village in the African section of my village called Kashma as a young boy, I do know of what David speaks, but the leadership of the African people, coming back to Mr. Kwana's caution to me, they, I believe, have exploited the ordinary African and those fears in them, and they whip them up at election time. And what I would like to say is that at this juncture of our history, we cannot assume that a new government, and because this is what it's all about, we have to be honest, that this election was rigged or is being rigged at the Region 4 count because of by this government, because they don't want to get out of office. But I think they're using the African Guyanese people to say, look, if we are out, look what will happen to you. They have built this bogeyman. In the past, it was Cherry Jagan and his communist proclivities. Today, it is Jagdeo, and having killed, I hear numbers of 400, 1,000, 1,400. The numbers keep escalating. But this is how we keep our people into the herd. And we have to look beyond that, look beyond the stereotypes. And I come back to my last point, which I make, coming back to what Ferlin had said, which is that we are a nation of minorities, and we have to now reach across. And I would like for all the parties to now deal with that reality. We can't go down the road with only dealing with Africans or Indians. It's not going to work.
All right, gentlemen, I want to thank both of you, Dr. Hinds and Mr. Dev, for joining us. And as I said before at the outset of the show, we are going to continue to have these kinds of discussion, and we want to go beyond, the hearsay. And I think both of you were very honest, brutally honest, I would say, in terms of expressing how you see the situation developing in Guyana. And again, I do want to say, I know, Mr. Hinds, you've been a very controversial figure. Hopefully we will get to some of those statements you've made at our next show on Wednesday. I also want to thank Ferlin. I think you're doing a great job as a young person. Keep on writing, because I do read your stuff. It's very enlightening, because the future, as I said, is all yours. Dr. Tara Singh, please make sure you're socially distancing. I know you're in Queens, where the coronavirus has actually has hit a lot of people. So
40 Guyanese so far.
Yeah, and that's a lot.
And that's
spreading. And Queens is a hot
quite
spot.
a lot. Yeah.
One brief statement. We cannot move forward to any new system proposed unless we follow rules. We must appreciate and embrace norms.
All right, so we will continue, with this discussion, and I hope all of you out there, whether you're in Guyana, in the homeland itself, or whether you're outside of Guyana in the diaspora. So join us next Wednesday for another discussion when we'll continue with this same topic, A Nation Divided. All right, so gentlemen, I'd like to bid you all good night, and please be safe, wear your mask, keep your gloves on, social distance is the way to go.
Self-isolation preferred.
Thank you.
All right. Good night.
All right.
Good night, everyone.